January 1945. The jungle of the Western Pacific breathes slowly under a moonless sky. The air is heavy with rot and damp earth. Leaves glisten, unmoving. Somewhere beyond the tree line, a Japanese forward position waits in enforced silence, rifles propped, sentries straining to hear past the insects and the distant surf. Men crouch in shallow pits, eyes open, bodies rigid. Sleep is no longer a certainty here. It has become a risk. A few hundred meters away, figures move without sound. Faces darkened. Equipment stripped to essentials. Boots carefully placed, never rushed. Canadian soldiers advance in single file, guided by hand signals and instinct sharpened over months of night fighting. No flares rise. No orders are spoken. The jungle itself seems unaware of their presence. Then, in seconds, the silence fractures, grenades, close-range fire, shadows dissolving back into darkness before any clear target can be found. When the night settles again, the position remains, but its rhythm is broken. The sentries do not relax. No one sleeps. And as dawn approaches, exhaustion weighs heavier than fear. This is not a single raid. It is a pattern. Repeated nights. Unanswered threats. A pressure that never lifts, and leads directly into the wider story of how these nights came to shape an entire battlefield. If this moment stayed with you, comment below, like it, and subscribe for more true World War II stories to be why the time the Pacific War reached its most brutal phase, Canada's military identity had already been forged in a very different environment. In September 1939, when Canada declared war on Germany, its strategic focus was firmly fixed on Europe. Canadian divisions trained for open terrain, mechanized maneuver, and set-piece battles alongside British forces. The early years of the war reinforced this orientation. Canadian troops bled on the beaches of Dieppe, fought through the hedgerows of Normandy, and advanced across northwest Europe in a war defined by artillery, armor, and logistics. The Pacific, vast and distant, remained largely peripheral to Canadian planning. That changed abruptly in December 1941. Japan's rapid expansion across Southeast Asia shattered Allied assumptions and forced a global reallocation of forces. Hong Kong fell within weeks. The Philippines collapsed. Singapore, long considered impregnable, surrendered in February 1942. Canadian units were not spared from this shock. Nearly 2,000 Canadian soldiers, sent to reinforce Hong Kong in late 1941, were overwhelmed by Japanese ground forces. The defeat left a deep scar on Canada's military consciousness and revealed the ruthless efficiency of Japanese infantry tactics, particularly their ability to operate aggressively at night. Japanese doctrine emphasized speed, infiltration, and psychological dominance. Night was not a pause in operations but an extension of the battlefield. Japanese units routinely attacked after dark, exploiting surprise and confusion. They moved silently through jungle and broken terrain, bypassing strong points and striking command posts or supply lines. For Allied troops trained to regroup and reorganize at night, this approach proved devastating. Defensive lines dissolved. Units lost cohesion. Fear spread faster than orders. As the war progressed, Allied commanders began to understand that survival in the Pacific required adaptation. The jungle was not merely a backdrop, it dictated the nature of combat. Visibility shrank to meters. Sound carried unpredictably. Heavy weapons lost effectiveness, while small unit leadership became decisive. Battles were often fought by platoons and sections rather than divisions. In this environment, night operations were unavoidable. To concede darkness was to concede initiative. Canadian forces, though limited in number in the Pacific compared to American units, absorbed these lessons through Commonwealth cooperation. Training manuals were rewritten. Jungle warfare schools emphasized stealth, patience, and endurance. Soldiers learned to navigate without light, to communicate without words, and to fight at distances where the enemy's breath could be heard. Night patrols ceased to be defensive precautions and became offensive tools. This shift marked the beginning of a doctrinal reversal. What had once been a Japanese advantage began to erode as Allied units, including Canadian formations, learned not just to endure night fighting, but to master it. And as this transformation took hold, the stage was set for a new kind of psychological warfare, one that unfolded almost entirely after sunset and would soon push Japanese units into a state of constant vigilance. By 1943 and into 1944, the character of the Pacific War had shifted from rapid Japanese expansion to a grinding struggle for control of islands, coastlines, and jungle interiors. Allied strategy focused on isolating Japanese garrisons, cutting supply lines, and wearing down enemy forces through sustained pressure rather than decisive single engagements. In this environment, Canadian units operating within broader Commonwealth and Allied frameworks encountered a form of warfare that rewarded discipline and adaptability more than raw numbers. The jungle imposed its own logic. Dense vegetation eliminated long sight lines and rendered traditional battlefield formations impractical. Movement was slow, exhausting, and dangerous even without enemy contact. Heat and humidity degraded weapons and bodies alike. Disease, insects, and constant dampness eroded morale. Under these conditions, night offered both danger and opportunity. Darkness concealed movement, reduced the effectiveness of heavy firepower, and magnified the psychological strain on isolated soldiers. Control of the night became a measure of battlefield dominance. Allied forces initially treated darkness as a defensive interval. Units dug in, posted sentries, and waited for dawn. But Japanese patrols exploited this passivity. They infiltrated positions, harassed supply routes, and launched sudden assaults designed less to seize ground than to exhaust and unsettle their opponents. Over time, Allied casualties and captured documents made the pattern clear. Japanese commanders understood that fear and sleep deprivation could weaken an enemy more reliably than artillery. In response, Commonwealth forces began to reverse the equation. Training emphasized aggressive night patrolling not as a reaction, but as a deliberate strategy. Canadian units, known for their discipline and methodical approach, proved well suited to this transformation. Patrols were carefully planned, objectives tightly defined, and withdrawal routes rehearsed in detail. Raids were not intended to hold ground. They were meant to disrupt, to kill or capture silently, and to vanish before a coherent response could form. These operations were conducted repeatedly, often against the same enemy positions. Predictability was avoided, but pressure was constant. Japanese soldiers began to experience night not as cover, but as vulnerability. Defensive positions that appeared secure by day became liabilities after dark. Sentries could not distinguish between jungle noise and approaching footsteps. Every snapped branch suggested movement. Every shadow became a threat. Reports from the front reflected a subtle but significant change. Japanese units devoted increasing manpower to night security, reducing their effectiveness during daylight operations. Fatigue accumulated. Commanders struggled to maintain morale among troops who no longer trusted the darkness that had once favored them. What began as tactical adaptation evolved into psychological dominance. This growing imbalance did not emerge from a single battle or dramatic engagement. It developed night after night, raid after raid, through a pattern of controlled violence and disciplined withdrawal. And within this pattern, distinct angles began to emerge, human, tactical, technological, and psychological, that reveal how these night raids reshaped the battlefield. The human experience of these night raids began long before the first step into the jungle. Canadian soldiers learned quickly that darkness magnified every sensation. Sweat felt colder. Sounds carried farther. Time slowed. Men moved not as individuals, but as parts of a living formation, each responsible for the silence and survival of the others. Fear was present, but it was controlled, channeled into caution rather than panic. Veterans later recalled that the most difficult part was not the violence itself, but the waiting, the hours spent motionless, listening to an enemy who could not be seen but was known to be close. For Japanese soldiers, the experience was profoundly different. Many had been trained to see night as an advantage, a space where spirit and aggression could compensate for material shortages. But Canadian raids challenged this belief. The attackers did not charge. They did not shout. They struck briefly and withdrew with discipline. Survivors were left with uncertainty rather than clarity. There was no clear enemy to pursue, no decisive moment to reclaim control. Sleep became fragmented. Men stayed awake longer, scanning darkness that offered no answers. Tactically, these raids reflected a careful balance between precision and restraint. Objectives were limited: a machine gun nest, a command post, a listening position. Canadian patrols avoided prolonged firefights. The goal was disruption, not engagement. Grenades were used sparingly, often followed by immediate withdrawal. Fire discipline was absolute. Each round had purpose, because sound itself could compromise the mission. This economy of force allowed small units to exert influence far beyond their numbers. The environment amplified every action. Jungle terrain absorbed light but reflected sound unpredictably. Rain muffled movement one moment and magnified it the next. The absence of clear landmarks made navigation a constant test of memory and instinct. Canadian patrol leaders relied on compass bearings, pacing, and intimate knowledge of the terrain. Mistakes could mean separation or, worse, collision with friendly forces returning along similar routes. Within this setting, night raids became less about destruction and more about erosion. Each successful incursion chipped away at the enemy's confidence. Japanese defensive routines grew rigid as commanders sought control through procedure. But rigidity proved vulnerable. The jungle favored adaptation, and those who learned to move fluidly within it gained a decisive edge. These human and tactical dimensions formed only part of the picture, leading into deeper questions of technology, leadership, and the unseen psychological toll. Technological factors played a quiet but important role in shaping these night operations. Canadian soldiers did not possess overwhelming advantages in equipment, but they understood the value of simplicity and reliability. Weapons were chosen and modified for close-range combat. Rifles and submachine guns were kept meticulously clean to prevent misfires in humid conditions. Bayonets, often dismissed in European theaters, regained relevance in the jungle where encounters could occur at arm's length. Grenades became tools of precision rather than shock, used to clear a specific position before immediate withdrawal. Even small details, taped metal parts, muffled gear, darkened skin and uniforms, reflected an understanding that survival depended on remaining unseen and unheard. Leadership was equally decisive. Canadian junior officers and non-commissioned officers were granted significant autonomy. Night patrols often unfolded beyond direct supervision, requiring leaders who could make rapid decisions without guidance. Orders emphasized intent rather than rigid instruction. If resistance was stronger than expected, withdrawal was acceptable. If an opportunity appeared, it could be exploited briefly, but never at the cost of surprise. This trust in small unit leadership contrasted sharply with the increasingly centralized control within many Japanese formations as the war progressed. On the Japanese side, technological and logistical limitations compounded the psychological strain. Shortages of flares, batteries, and replacement weapons reduced the effectiveness of night defenses. Fixed positions relied heavily on sentries and listening posts, which became focal points for Canadian raids. Each loss forced commanders to stretch their remaining manpower thinner, creating gaps that invited further incursions. Attempts to reinforce night security often resulted in exhausted soldiers during daylight hours, weakening overall combat effectiveness. The psychological angle tied these elements together. Fear did not always manifest as panic. More often, it appeared as tension without release. Japanese soldiers learned that silence no longer meant safety. The absence of contact was not reassuring, it was ominous. Diaries and post-war testimonies describe nights spent awake, gripping rifles, minds racing at every unfamiliar sound. Canadian patrols did not need to strike every night. The possibility that they might was enough to unsettle entire units. Over time, this imbalance reshaped behavior on both sides. Canadian soldiers grew more confident, moving with patience rather than haste. Japanese units became reactive, conserving energy for threats that might never materialize. The night, once a domain of Japanese initiative, had been contested and, in many areas, quietly taken away. This shift did not announce itself with a single battle, but it accumulated toward a decisive turning point where pressure, fatigue, and fear converged. By late 1944 and early 1945, the cumulative effect of sustained night operations reached a critical threshold. In several Pacific sectors where Canadian units operated alongside Commonwealth and Allied forces, Japanese commanders began reporting a marked decline in troop endurance. These were not sudden collapses, but gradual unravelings. Patrol logs and after-action reports noted enemy positions that appeared intact by day yet showed signs of disorder by night, abandoned listening posts, irregular sentry rotations, and defensive fires triggered by imagined movement. Specific nights stood out not because of their scale, but because of their repetition. Canadian patrols returned to the same areas, never following identical routes, never striking at predictable hours. Some raids resulted in brief, violent contact. Others ended without a shot fired. Both were effective. Silence could be as unsettling as loss. Japanese units struggled to interpret these patterns. Commanders debated whether the raids were reconnaissance, harassment, or preparations for larger attacks. The uncertainty itself became a weapon. At the tactical level, Canadian leaders refined their approach. Raids were timed to exploit fatigue, often just before dawn when enemy alertness was lowest. Withdrawal routes were rehearsed repeatedly to prevent confusion under pressure. Casualties were minimized not through overwhelming firepower, but through control. If surprise was lost, the raid ended. The jungle absorbed the retreat, leaving behind little evidence beyond disturbed ground and unanswered questions. Japanese responses grew increasingly desperate. Flares were fired into empty darkness. Random bursts of machine gun fire tore through foliage without targets. These measures consumed ammunition and energy but restored no sense of security. Each false alarm further eroded discipline. Soldiers who had been awake all night faced daylight duties with dulled senses, compounding the cycle of exhaustion. The turning point was not a single engagement, but the realization on both sides that the night now favored the attacker who understood restraint. Canadian units had learned to strike without needing to dominate terrain. Japanese forces, once confident in nocturnal aggression, found themselves defending against an enemy who did not seek decisive confrontation. This imbalance intensified with each passing week, pushing the situation toward a moment where the psychological cost outweighed any remaining tactical benefit. As weeks turned into months, the accumulated pressure reached a point where Japanese defensive cohesion began to fracture. Reports intercepted by Allied intelligence and observations recorded by frontline units described a growing reluctance among Japanese soldiers to maintain exposed night positions. Sentries were pulled back closer to main camps. Listening posts were reduced or abandoned altogether. These adjustments, meant to preserve manpower, instead created blind zones that Canadian patrols exploited with increasing confidence. The decisive change occurred when night raids ceased to be isolated events and became an expected condition of existence. Japanese soldiers no longer prepared for specific attacks. They prepared for endless vigilance. Sleep was rationed in short, uneasy intervals. Men remained clothed, weapons in hand, even during brief rest periods. Commanders struggled to enforce discipline among troops whose nerves were already frayed. Minor incidents escalated into confusion. A dropped canteen or sudden animal movement could trigger defensive fire, exposing positions and exhausting ammunition reserves. Canadian patrols observed these changes directly. They noted slower reactions, delayed counterattacks, and fewer coordinated responses. Raids encountered less resistance, not because the enemy was absent, but because they were drained. When contact did occur, it was often disorganized. Some Japanese units attempted counter-patrols, but these lacked the stealth and coordination required for effective night operations and rarely achieved surprise. This was the true turning point. The night, once a shared danger, had become asymmetrical. Canadian units operated within a framework of control and recovery. After raids, they rested, regrouped, and prepared for the next mission. Japanese units remained trapped in a continuous state of alert. The psychological cost compounded faster than physical losses. Fear was no longer tied to specific threats. It became ambient, ever-present. By early 1945, Allied commanders recognized the strategic value of this imbalance. Night raids were integrated into broader operational planning, not as preliminary actions, but as sustained pressure tools. They shaped enemy behavior, dictated defensive posture, and reduced resistance before daylight engagements even began. The outcome was not immediately visible on maps, but it was decisive in human terms. With the turning point passed, the effects of these nights became increasingly evident in the days that followed, leading directly into the aftermath felt by both armies long after the firing stopped. The immediate aftermath of sustained Canadian night raids was not marked by dramatic surrenders or sweeping territorial gains. Instead, it revealed itself through subtle but measurable shifts in battlefield behavior. Japanese units that had once maintained aggressive perimeter defenses now conserved energy, avoiding unnecessary movement after dark. Patrol activity declined. Commanders limited night operations to essential tasks, acknowledging, often implicitly, that control of the darkness had been lost. Casualty figures alone did not tell the full story. While night raids did inflict losses, their greater impact lay in how they distorted Japanese operational rhythm. Reports from Allied observers noted slower response times during daylight engagements and a decline in coordinated counterattacks. Units arrived late to positions or failed to exploit opportunities, their effectiveness blunted by fatigue accumulated over countless sleepless nights. The erosion was gradual but relentless. Canadian forces experienced a different outcome. Confidence replaced uncertainty. Soldiers trusted their training and leadership, knowing that discipline and restraint reduced risk. Night operations became routine rather than exceptional. Patrol leaders refined their methods, passing lessons learned to new units. This institutional memory strengthened overall combat effectiveness and reduced casualties over time. The jungle remained dangerous, but it was no longer mysterious. Strategically, these effects compounded across the theater. Japanese commanders diverted manpower to night security, weakening other sectors. Supplies were consumed at unsustainable rates as ammunition was expended on false alarms. Morale suffered as soldiers recognized the imbalance but lacked the resources to correct it. Allied planners noted that enemy resistance often softened before major assaults, a sign that psychological pressure had already done much of the work. This phase of the aftermath revealed a truth often overlooked in traditional battle narratives. Dominance does not always require decisive engagement. Sometimes, it emerges through endurance and control. And as the war progressed toward its conclusion, the long-term implications of these nights began to shape post-war assessments and doctrinal changes. In the longer term, the legacy of Canadian night raids extended beyond the immediate battlefield. Post-war analyses by Allied militaries highlighted these operations as examples of how small, disciplined units could exert disproportionate influence through psychological pressure. Training doctrines evolved to emphasize night fighting as a core competency rather than a specialized skill. The lessons learned in the Pacific influenced future approaches to irregular and close-terrain warfare, where control of time and tempo mattered as much as control of ground. For Japanese forces, the aftermath was marked by reflection and acknowledgement of structural limitations. Surviving officers and soldiers later described the cumulative exhaustion and sense of helplessness that accompanied sustained night harassment. These accounts did not dwell on specific defeats, but on the feeling of being worn down by an enemy who never sought decisive confrontation. The night, once a symbol of initiative and spiritual resolve, became associated with vulnerability and uncertainty. The human cost endured long after combat ended. Veterans on both sides carried memories of sleeplessness and tension, of nights spent listening rather than resting. For Canadians, these experiences reinforced the value of patience and preparation. For Japanese survivors, they underscored the limits of endurance under constant pressure. The psychological dimension of warfare, often overshadowed by material factors, emerged as a decisive element. Historically, these operations challenged simplistic narratives of the Pacific War. They demonstrated that Allied success was not solely a product of overwhelming resources, but of adaptation and learning. The ability to contest and ultimately dominate the night reflected a deeper transformation, one rooted in humility, observation, and disciplined execution. As the war drew to a close, the echoes of those nights lingered, shaping how soldiers and historians alike understood the nature of conflict in the jungle and setting the stage for a final reflection on what these silent battles truly meant. When the fighting ended and the jungle slowly reclaimed the scars of war, the nights grew quiet again. Yet the legacy of those hours did not fade with the gunfire. The Canadian night raids in the Pacific were never intended to be remembered as grand offensives or decisive battles. They left few monuments and shifted few lines on maps. Their significance lay elsewhere, in the understanding that warfare is not only a contest of firepower, but of endurance, discipline, and the human need for rest. These operations revealed how control of time can become control of will. By denying the enemy the simple certainty of sleep, Canadian soldiers reshaped the psychological landscape of the battlefield. Fear did not come from overwhelming force, but from the knowledge that danger could emerge at any moment and vanish without warning. It was a quiet form of dominance, achieved through restraint rather than excess. Historically, this chapter challenges the notion that smaller forces play only supporting roles. In the shadows of larger Allied campaigns, Canadian units demonstrated how adaptation and professionalism could alter the balance of power. Their success was not rooted in aggression alone, but in learning the jungle, learning the enemy, and learning themselves. For the men who lived those nights, the memory was personal and lasting. The tension, the silence, the careful steps taken in darkness shaped how they understood both war and peace. And for history, these raids stand as a reminder that some of the most consequential battles are fought not in daylight triumphs, but in the long, quiet hours when resolve is tested and the outcome is decided one sleepless night at a time.